I'm Deacon Chris May. I'm what am I? An associate or something of the Maurin Academy. Anyways, um, we're going to have a little talk tonight about the universal destination of goods. This is something that we find really throughout the Jewish and the Christian traditions. In my blurb, I said we were going to take it historically and start back with Mosaic Law and then lead all the way up to contemporary Catholic social teaching. I'm actually going to invert that sequence, and first we'll present what the Catholic Church has taught on this topic. Then we'll go back and we'll look at where we see traces of it throughout the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition. So the universal destination of goods means that the goods of the earth are destined for the benefit of everybody. There is a right to private property, but it's at the service of the universal destination of goods. Private property gives order to the ownership of goods so that they can be distributed fairly between people. Without the right to private property, things would be much more chaotic. My citations are going to be from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which, well, it's continually revised. I guess it came out in maybe 1982, something like that. Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which came out, maybe 15 years ago. Popularum Progressio, which was Paul VI letter on the progress of peoples from 1967. And then later on, we'll look at some scriptural quotations. There are a couple of points that will help us to make some distinctions here, because Catholic moral teachings are always about making distinctions. The right to own is separate from the right to use. I might own something, that doesn't mean I can use it any way I want. I might be able to use something, that doesn't mean that I own it. Ownership can be individual and exclusive. That's the way we tend to think of it under our present economic order. I can make a pile of money and then go build a rocket ship for myself. It's mine. Or ownership can be common and inclusive. And lastly, charity and justice are complementary. When we think of caring for the poor, we think of charity, taking care of them, giving them stuff. But justice is the other part of that equation. And you need those 2 feet, the 2 feet of charity and justice. So this is from Paul VI, Popularum Progressio. No one may appropriate surplus goods solely for his own private use when others lack the bare necessities of life. In short, as the fathers of the church and other eminent theologians tell us, the right of private property may never be exercised to the detriment of the common good. And we'll have to have a class on the common good one of these days. Now, what sticks out to me in this quotation is the word private use. He's not talking here about ownership. He's talking about private use. You cannot appropriate it for your private use, keeping others from it. Same thing we find in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute and untouchable. On the contrary, it has always understood this right within the broader context of the right common to all of us to use the goods of the whole of creation. The right to private property is subordinated to the right to common use, to the fact that goods are meant for everyone. This principle is not opposed to the right to private property, but indicates the need to regulate it. Private property, in fact, regardless of the concrete forms of the regulations and juridical norms relative to it, is in essence only an instrument for respecting the principle of the universal destination of goods. In the final analysis, therefore, it is not an end, but a means. So the idea of private property is a means to the end of the universal destination of goods. And once again, we see the emphasis on use, common use. So the right to own property is separate from the right to use property. I have in here a quote from Fulton J. Sheen. He was a very popular Catholic radio and television speaker back in the 40s and the 50s, even into the 60s, I guess. He was in no way a radical. In 1940, he wrote a book on political economy, freedom under God. And remember, this was the age when the Catholic Church was implacably opposed to any hint of socialism or communism. And Catholics went out of their way to prove that they were good, loyal, true blue Americans. And he wrote, "It is wrong to confuse each person's natural right to be an owner with the rights that an owner has in the thing owned, and how what is owned can be used. This distinction seems trivial and even meaningless to people who confuse the right to property and the rights of property. So ownership of property does not entitle me to use it any way I choose." The most obvious example of that would be zoning laws for those of us who live in areas of the country that have them. I cannot bulldoze my house and turn it into a radioactive waste dump. There's I need to use it consistent with the common good. Private property should serve the common good. I shouldn't, it's not there for me to accumulate it ad infinitum. This is from the Catechism. The right to private property acquired by work or received from others by inheritance or gift does not do away with the original gift of the earth to the whole of mankind. The universal destination of goods remains primordial, even if the promotion of the common good requires respect for the right to private property and its exercise. If I own something, it doesn't mean that I am free to use it in a way that is contrary to the common good. In his use of things, man should regard the external goods he legitimately owns not merely as exclusive to himself, but common to others also, in the sense that they can benefit others as well as himself. The ownership of any property makes its holder a steward of providence, with the task of making it fruitful and communicating its benefit to others, first of all, his family. So we see here a hint of the Catholic emphasis on subsidiarity and localism and local community. We have obligations first to our families, next to our communities, and so on all the way out. Goods of production, such as land, factories, practical or artistic skills, oblige their possessors to employ them in ways that will benefit the greatest number. Those who hold goods for use and consumption should use them with moderation, reserving the better part for guests, for the sick, and for the poor. This really goes contrary to the whole American ethic of accumulation and of materialism and of more and more and more stuff. Well, that's another class. There is a need for regulation. The goods of creation are destined for the entire human race. The right to private property does not abolish the universal destination of goods. Political authority has the right and duty to regulate the legitimate exercise of the right to ownership for the sake of the common good. And this gets very, very tricky. How much should be done by what level of government? Once again, it gets into the whole issue of subsidiarity. The church wants to have things done at the lowest level possible, but if the lowest level cannot do it, then it needs to be done at a higher level. One example would be for during the Dust Bowl in the early days of the Depression. Mr. Coolidge was, Mr. Hoover rather, was waiting for the market to fix the economy. and things were in quite a mess. And it wasn't until Mr. Roosevelt came in with his programs that things started to improve. Those things needed to be done on a national level. They couldn't have been done on a local level. Um, on the other hand, we've seen the decline of community and of organizations, of memberships. Used to be people in the same building or on the same block or in the same neighborhood took care of each other. That still goes on, but there's less and less of it. And we see as the connections of civil society and of locality, of neighborhoods, of communities are being ripped apart through the efforts of neoliberal capitalism. Those organizations that used to function to care for people in the community are really no longer as strong as they used to be. So we see more and more people expecting the federal government or a higher level of government to come in and solve problems. This is from Popular Progressio. Created goods should flow fairly to all. Every man has the right to glean what he needs from the earth. The recent council reiterated this truth. God intended the earth and everything in it for the use of all human beings and peoples. Thus, under the leadership of justice and in the company of charity, created goods should flow fairly to all. Notice it says fairly, not equally. All other rights, whatever they may be, including the rights of property and free trade, are to be subordinated to this principle. They should in no way hinder it. In fact, they should actively facilitate its implementation. Redirecting these rights back to their original purpose must be regarded as an important and urgent social duty. The development of economic activity and growth in production are meant to provide for the needs of human beings. So the economy is there to serve human beings, not the other way around. Economic life is not meant solely to multiply goods produced and increase profit or power. It is ordered first of all to the service of persons, of the whole person, and of the entire human community. Economic activity conducted according to its own proper methods is to be exercised within the limits of the moral order, keeping with social justice so as to correspond to God's plan for humanity. Now, the church recalls a time when much of the land that we lived on was used in common by the local community for living, for farming, grazing, hunting, fishing, harvesting fuel. We've seen this disappear over the last few centuries in various countries in various ways. It's still going on today in the global south, where people are being deprived of their land, the land that they've held in common. There may have been indigenous peoples who even had no idea of the ownership of land. They signed it away, not realizing that it was even possible for one person to own the land. We certainly saw in Europe under the old medieval order where the poor were cared for and they had the right to take advantage of the common land. These lands were seized and privatized at different times through different methods in different lands by different ways. But it's all what we would call the theft of the commons or the primitive accumulation, where people were driven off the land and forced to go work for wages. But the church recalls a time when land and a lot of property was held in common. And even as a kid growing up in the country, it was considered bad form to post your land. Posting your land, no trespassing, that was something the city people did when they moved in. But the country people went on to each other's land all the time. They hiked on it, they hunted on it, they knew enough to use it responsibly. And I don't know if that's still the case in the country or not, but it used to be a nice way to live. Sheen goes on talking about the joint ownership of limited resources. He says it also may be appropriate at times to limit the ways in which something may be privately owned. Such possessions as land and natural resources, for example, being finite and created without human input, may call for different forms of private ownership than man-made capital. When I think of the joint ownership of limited resources, a branch of my family lives in a fairly poor, fairly remote agricultural valley. And probably 20 or 30 years ago, the government gave them some breeding stock. So they gave a stallion and a bull and a ram and so on to the community to use for breeding their animals. And these were owned in common. And the farmers in the valley would get together and decide, well, who gets to use the stallion this week? Who's going to overwinter the bull? And it was something that they owned, but they owned in common. And they got together to agree how to use it. Sheen goes on, in the case of joint ownership, every person could have a defined private property stake by owning a share of the whole without necessarily identifying which part of the whole belongs to each person. Corporations and cooperatives are owned in this manner, as were the so-called commons, with each resident having the defined right to, for example, graze a certain number of animals or gather a certain amount of fuel. Even growing up in New England, every town had its town commons. Getting into the commandment, thou shalt not steal, forbids unjustly taking or keeping the goods of one's neighbor and wronging him in any way with respect to his goods. It commands justice and charity in the care of earthly goods and the fruit of men's labor. For the sake of the common good, it requires respect for the universal destination of goods and respect for the right to private property. Christian life strives to order this world's goods to God and to fraternal charity. So charity and justice are complementary. We need both of them. They're the 2 feet. Without charity, without justice means you're always putting Band-Aids on serious wounds without looking to see why are people so wounded by the prevailing economic system. I tried to track down the source of this quote, and it's attributed to both Dorothy Day and Dom Helder Camara, who was a bishop in the diocese of, I think, in Brazil. When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. Now, we get into the topic of expropriation. We've mentioned there is a right to private property that's necessary for the ordering of society, but that is not absolute. And there are times when that can be violated ethically. The 7th commandment forbids theft, that is, usurping another's property against the reasonable will of the owner. There's no theft if consent can be presumed or if refusal is contrary to reason and the universal destination of goods. This is the case in obvious and urgent necessity, when the only way to provide for immediate essential needs is to put at one's disposal and use the property of others. So here the church is saying it is legitimate to take from one who has an excess if I need it to stay alive. Doesn't mean I can bring a laptop home from work because I have so many of them and I need one. But if I need it for my essential needs and I'm taking from someone else's surplus, it's morally acceptable. So the instance that comes to mind is Jean Valjean in Les Mis. who was sent to prison for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his children. And according to the teachings of the church, that would be legitimate. It would be all right to steal a loaf of bread off the bread truck to feed your children. Unfortunately, that's the plot that drives the whole novel. There's another scene in there that I like, which I think shows the church at its best. Jean Valjean is staying overnight in the house of the bishop, and he gets up the next day and he steals the silver. And the police find him and bring him back to the bishop, and they say, Your Grace, Your Grace, this man stole your silver. We're here to bring it back to you. And the bishop goes over and picks up 2 silver candlesticks and says, Oh, no, no, no. I gave it to him. Here, you forgot the candlesticks too. Take them. And to me, that always showed the Roman Church at its best. It doesn't always live up to that, but at its best. Now, I checked with my rabbi on this, and he says that Jewish law also permits this. Jewish law also permits taking things, if I needed to stay alive, taking it from someone else's surplus. And he told me they add the little proviso that you should repay it eventually if you can, which I think is a nice little addition. Further in the Catechism, in the beginning, God entrusted the earth and its resources to the common stewardship of mankind to take care of them, master them by labor, and enjoy their fruits. The goods of creation are destined for the whole human race. However, the earth is divided up among men to ensure the security of their lives, endangered by poverty and threatened by violence. The appropriation of property is legitimate for guaranteeing the freedom and dignity of persons and for helping each of them to meet his basic needs and the needs of those in his charge. It should allow for a natural solidarity to develop between persons. Now, you can see how this could be taken immoderately and abused. Somebody could say, I should put up cots in my living room to house the unhoused in the neighborhood. One could say I would have to do that. So it's not carte blanche, but it allows for it to be done in a reasonable way. The church also permits the expropriation of landed estates. We had large landed estates in Latin America owned by a few families, and many poor people who did not have the way to work the land and provide food for their families. So the church allows this. If certain landed estates impede the general prosperity because they are extensive, unused, or poorly used, or because they bring hardship to peoples or are detrimental to the interest of the country, the common good sometimes demands their expropriation. Vatican II affirms this emphatically in Gaudium et Spes. At the same time, it clearly teaches that income thus derived is not for man's capricious use, and that the exclusive pursuit of personal gain is prohibited. So the document went on to say that the owners should be compensated for the land that is seized, according to this. And it goes on further to say that the money they get as compensation should not be sent off to an offshore bank. It should be kept in the country to be used in the banking system of the country. So that's it for the presentation of what the church teaches about it now. I'm going to dig into where we find this historically in the tradition. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions or objections or comments?
Chris, I have a question. What's the justification for property inequality in a nutshell?
The justification for property, in other words, why don't we all share equally?
Right.
Well, that was addressed really in Rerum Novarum, where the right to private property was defended because it gives people an incentive. And you have to, practically speaking, knowing human nature, you have to thread your way carefully on this so that people have an incentive. Um, I don't have a definitive answer to that. You know, there was the old joke in the Soviet Union: we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, where whole sectors of the economy just ground to a halt. Um, what does a bit of expropriation mean for taxation? Um, are you asking, Jacob, is expropriation seen as is taxation seen as a form of expropriation?
Yeah, or like would it be justified or not justified? Since like I feel like the argument could be made either way.
Oh no, you know, there is a role for government, and there is a role for regulation, and government needs money to function. And I mean, we've seen in the last 40 years or so what happens when things are turned over to the private market, with private prisons and everything being privatized. And I don't see it working any better than when the government ran it. So yeah, no, taxation is certainly allowed. Now, there have been times in the past when taxation was used to impoverish the people and drive them from the land so their land could be seized by the government. And um, that would not be acceptable. We saw that in the story of Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis. We saw it again in the first century Palestine, where taxes were the equivalent of about 40 to 50% to finance King Herod's building programs. And if people couldn't pay, their land was seized. And that's why you had so many itinerant people following Jesus around, because they'd lost their land to taxation. So there certainly is a justification for taxes. Americans seem to not like to pay taxes. There are other countries where people take pride in paying their taxes. Here, people seem to see it as theft. We have a comment here from Eliana. Oh, okay. Can you hear me better now, Emily and Spencer?
I think so. I think it sounds better when you're like talking towards your camera, I guess it looks like.
Okay. All right.
Just
I'm actually using an antique microphone.
okay. But yeah.
Yes, okay. The kingdom of God being kept from its rightful inheritors. Keep using his own. Yes. And you see some translators and commentators reading the Christian New Testament now and seeing it as being a handbook for dealing with an oppressive kleptomaniac military occupation force. Can I share the slide? I don't see why not. Sure. Okay. So we see this throughout. This goes all the way back to the book of Exodus, when the people are fleeing slavery in Egypt and they're hungry and they're given manna from heaven. Gather as much as each person needs. Some gathered a large amount, some gathered a small. But when they measured it out, the one who had gathered a large amount did not have too much, and the one who had gathered a small amount did not have too little. They gathered as much as each needed to eat. Moses said, "Let no one leave any of it over till morning," but they did not listen to Moses, and some kept a part of it over until the morning, and it became wormy and stank. So we have the idea that God provides what each person needs. The Mosaic Law had quite a lot to say about care for the poor. And it established the idea that the ownership of property is different from the proper use of that property. So there were the laws on gleaning. We see these in several places, and there are 3 parts of the crop that must be left behind for the poor. Are the corners of the field. So when you're harvesting, you don't go hedgerow to hedgerow. You leave the corners for the poor. The second harvest, anything that was left over, anything you missed the first time through, and any part of the crop that you've forgotten and left behind, you cannot go back a second time and get it. It is to be left for the poor. So you may own the field, you may own the crop, but that doesn't mean you get to reap 100% of it. You must leave some of it for the widow and the orphan and the poor. So you see it in a couple of different places. You shall not be so thorough that you reap the field to its very edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare, nor gather up the grapes that have fallen. These things you shall leave for the poor and the alien. Again, a few chapters later, when you reap the harvest, you shall not be so thorough that you reap the field to its very edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. These things you shall leave for the poor and the alien. Deuteronomy, again, if you overlook a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. Let it be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you knock fruit down from your olive trees, you do not go over the branches a second time. Let what remains be for the resident alien, the orphan, and the widow. Same with your grapes. So we see the idea going back to the Mosaic Law. Throughout the Mosaic Law and later on in the prophets of Israel, we see again and again and again the urge to care for the poor, not to steal from the poor. There was also the idea of the Jubilee. Historians debate whether and when and to what extent this was practiced. They also debate was it every 49 years or every 50 years. But according to the law on Jubilee, every 49 or 50 years, all debts were forgiven. All land was returned to the original owner. And all Hebrew indentured servants were freed. So it was a fresh start. Land could be bought on leasehold. It couldn't be alienated permanently. Jubilee was practiced only while all the Hebrew tribes were in the promised land. So it was a fairly limited period of time, the rabbis tell me. But the idea was that the indebtedness, the loss of land, the loss of freedom is limited to no more than 49 or 50 years. Then everything is restored and we all start fresh all over again. And you see it throughout the Old Testament. This is from the Deuterocanonical book of Tobit. Do not turn your face away from the poor, so that God's face will not be turned away from you. Give in proportion to what you own. If you have great wealth, give alms out of your abundance. If you have but little, do not be afraid to give alms even from that. Give to the hungry some of your food, and to the naked some of your clothing. Whatever you have left over, give away as alms, and do not let your eye begrudge the alms that you give. Okay, and Jacob, I see Marx was critiquing the wood theft laws.
Yeah. Just threw that into your bit on gleaning, sorry.
Okay. Was that back when we were able to harvest wood from the land, from the commons?
Poor peasants used to be able to harvest firewood from the Lord's forest, and then that started being prevented. And Marx laid out a justification that his language is like eerily similar to what you've been presenting here.
I seem to remember a winter or two when I was young and poor, maybe harvesting a log or two from the Lord's forest. When we get into the New Testament, we see it again. John the Baptizer is asked, "What should we do?" He said, "Whoever has 2 tunics should share with the person who has none. Whoever has food should do likewise." And the idea that you cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon, of course, being actually a false idol, a false god. We see throughout Jesus encouraging voluntary poverty. He says to the rich young man, "If you wish to be perfect, sell what you have and give to the poor, then come follow me." When the young man heard this, he went away sad, for he had many possessions. Then Jesus said, "Amen, I say to you, it'll be hard for one who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven." So far, we're seeing the encouragement of charity. It's about to take a much darker turn here with the Matthew's, the apocalypse in Matthew's gospel, which many of us would have heard last Sunday. It's a long passage, so I'm going to read the whole thing. It's also one that in my tradition we frequently read at funerals, which is always interesting. Now, remember, this has all of these first century images in it of kings and goats and eternal fire and angels and demons and so on. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be assembled before him. And he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. A stranger and you welcomed me. Naked and you clothed me. Ill and you cared for me. In prison and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him and say, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and visit you?" And the king will say to them in reply, "Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. A stranger, and you gave me no welcome. Naked, and you gave me no clothing. Ill and in prison, and you did not care for me." Then they will answer and say, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or naked or ill or in prison, and not minister to your needs?" He will answer them, "Amen, I say to you, what you did not do for one of these least ones, you did not do for me." And these will go off to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So here we see the giving to the poor, caring for the poor, is not a question of optional charity. It's not something I do if I want to, out of my surplus, but rather it's a requirement. Because the ones who don't do it are cast into eternal punishment. I'd say that's pretty close to making a moral judgment here, that not doing this leaves one liable to punishment. So here we have it postulated not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of justice, something that we are required to do. Many times people, when they think of Christianity, they think of Christians as being very judgy, very judgmental, always passing judgment on them. There's actually relatively little of that in the Gospels. This is one of the only instances I can think of where I see Jesus passing judgment on people, and it's when they fail to care for the poor. The only other time I think would be a couple of instances where he is judging religious leaders harshly for placing undue burdens on the people. But here, this is probably the longest passage talking about judgment, and it comes about when we have failed to care for those who are in need. So it's no longer an option. The early Christians owned everything in common. They would sell their property and possessions and divide it among all according to each one's needs. And we have a wonderful little story here in Acts of some people who didn't do that. So we see that sharing of property is no longer optional. The community of believers was of one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they had everything in common. There was no needy person among them. For those who owned property or houses would sell them, bring the proceeds of the sale, and put them at the feet of the apostles, and they were distributed to each according to need. Thus Joseph, also named by the apostles Barnabas, sold a piece of property that he owned, then brought the money and put it at the feet of the apostles. A man named Ananias, however, with his wife Sapphira, sold a piece of property. He retained for himself, with his wife's knowledge, some of the purchase price, took the remainder and put it at the feet of the apostles. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart so that you lied to the Holy Spirit and retained part of the price of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain yours? And when it was sold, was it not still under your control? Why did you contrive this deed? You've not lied to human beings, but to God. When Ananias heard these words, he fell down and breathed his last, and great fear came upon all who heard of it. The young men came and wrapped him up, then carried him out and buried him. After an interval of about 3 hours, his wife came in, unaware of what had happened. Peter said to her, Tell me, did you sell the land for this amount? She answered, Yes, for that amount. Then Peter said to her, Why did you agree to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the footsteps of those who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out. At once she fell down at his feet and breathed her last. When the young men entered, they found her dead. So they carried her out and buried her beside her husband. I guess that's one way of encouraging cooperation. And Lori, getting back to your question about why not just distribute things equally, I think that I've seen that work in small communities, small religious communities, even some small secular communes where property is distributed equally depending on what people need. I've seen it work in communities up to maybe several hundred people, but I don't know if you could really order the whole world economy that way. Do you think it would be practical?
No, I don't think so. And I just was wondering, kind of what the church's justification of it was. But I think that practical justification is probably good enough, actually, just based on
Yeah.
common sense as well as history. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So we've traced it through the Mosaic Law, the later Hebrew tradition of the prophets, into the New Testament, the first century Christian writings, and now we get into the church fathers. Once again, the same theme from Ambrose of Milan, who was the the teacher of St. Augustine. Ambrose was also notable for his ability to read without moving his lips. He could read silently without reading aloud, without moving his lips, which was quite a feat at that time. And people would come and watch him do this. But anyways, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, wrote, "You're not making a gift of what's yours to the poor man, but you're giving him back what is his. You've been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich." Cyprian, "The property of the wealthy holds them in chains, which shackle their courage and choke their faith and hamper their judgment and throttle their souls. They think of themselves as owners, where it is they rather who are owned, enslaved as they are to their own property. They are not the masters of their money, but its slaves." I live in kind of an older planned community. We have wide streets, and then we have alleyways behind. The alleyways are where the utility lines run, where the garages are, where we're supposed to park our cars and keep our trash cans. So the streets are there as a nice wide streetscape. But I find more and more people are not able to park their cars in the back, in the alleyways or in the driveways or in the garages, because their garages are full of stuff. The cars spill out onto the main road because people have so much stuff. There's no room to park their vehicles back where they should. So it's, it was a nice idea of city planning, but people have too much stuff. Basil of Caesarea, "The bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry man. The coat hanging in your closet belongs to the man who needs it. The shoes rotting in your closet belong to the man who has no shoes. The money which you put in the bank belongs to the poor. You do wrong to everyone you could help, but fail to help." John Chrysostom, "The rich are in possession of the goods of the poor, even if they have acquired them honestly or inherited them legally. Not to enable the poor to share in our goods is to steal from them and deprive them of life. The goods we possess are not ours, but theirs." Irenaeus, "The Lord said to divide everything we have with the poor. He said to love not only our neighbors, but also our enemies, and to be givers and sharers, not only with the good, but also to be liberal givers towards those who take away our possessions." The Didache, which is, it's anonymous, but it was in wide circulation in the late 1st century as a handbook to guide the early Christians. "Share everything with your brother. Do not say it is private property. If you share what is everlasting, you should be that much more willing to share things which do not last." Clement of Rome, who was the fourth bishop of Rome. "Let the strong take care of the weak. Let the weak respect the strong. Let the rich minister to the poor. Let the poor give thanks to God that he gave him one through whom his needs might be satisfied." Basil of Caesarea, "How can I make you realize the misery of the poor? How can I make you understand that your wealth comes from their weeping?" So that commandment against stealing, which in the Catholic, Orthodox, and Lutheran traditions would be the 7th commandment. That was not designed to, it was not intended to keep the poor from stealing from the rich. It was to keep the rich from stealing from the poor. And here was an observation of the Christians. They love one another. They do not overlook the widow, and they save the orphan. The one who has ministers ungrudgingly to the one who does not have. When they see a stranger, they take him under their own roof and rejoice over him as a true brother. For they do not call themselves brothers according to the flesh, but according to the soul. So in sum, the points that we looked at are: the goods of creation are destined for all persons. The right to own is separate from the right to use. Ownership can be individual and exclusive. So I have it, nobody else can have it. Or common and inclusive. I share it with others. Charity and justice are complementary. Justice is giving each person what is due to him or her. So sharing the goods of creation with those in need is an act of justice. Charity goes beyond justice. Charity shares more than we are required to share under justice. Sharing with the poor is not optional. It is justice, and it is required by the moral law. And I think that's all the wisdom I have to share tonight. So let me stop showing my screen here. Okay, nice to see everybody. Questions or comments, objections?